Welcome to Common Ground Discourse. We are your hosts. My name is Shane Swor.
God's peace. I'm Brother Kenneth.
We are continuing our review on Sam Harris's book. We bring you to episode 9, and today we will be talking about belief. The foundation of what is defining how we think about the world, our perception on truth and reality. And to get to moral reasoning or reasoning in general, we do need to take a look at what we believe. So we're going to be going over the following points. We're going to redefine what belief is, how do we believe, what is the act of believing, where is belief located in the brain, its impact on how we perceive reality, understanding our biases and how that has an impact on our belief, understanding our limits of understanding itself, how belief affects our reasoning, and ultimately, do we have freedom from belief? Do we have a choice of what we believe? And what cognitive function goes into determining what we believe? And then we'll finish off with some final thoughts. So redefining, earlier in his book, Sam mentioned that belief is simply our act to map our thoughts to reality, our best efforts to do so. And in this chapter, he goes in to explain that most of what we believe outside of our individual experience is linguistic propositions that are given to us. And the core of belief that he wants to tackle here is how it's defined in the Oxford Dictionary. And let's not mess that up. I'm going to reference that now. There are multiple definitions, and do you think it's necessary to go over all three? I'd like to go over the one specifically that he focuses on.
The one that he focuses on and the one that he throws out.
Yeah.
Because the one that he throws out is what most in a theistic circle would recognize as belief.
Well, let's go at it in reverse. The one that he throws out is the third definition in the dictionary. The thing believed, the proposition or set of propositions held true. And I think a reason he does that is because it seems very data-centered and not one that lends itself to the research that he's been conducting, which makes sense. He wants to focus on what he's making an effort to propose here. The second definition, mental acceptance of a proposition, statement, or fact is true, on the ground of authority or evidence, assent of the mind to a statement or to the truth of a fact beyond observation, on the testimony of another, or to a fact or truth on the evidence of consciousness, the mental condition involved in this assent. And that, in its sense, is the core of what belief is. And again, going back to linguistic propositions, just to give some examples here, that Julius Caesar was a Roman emperor. Mm-hmm. Obviously, we don't have the ability to discover that for ourselves, that we can't experience that, so we go off of what that proposition is. And I think it's interesting for me to look at it this way because we can address the phrase that so many theists will propose to atheists that, an atheist doesn't believe in anything. Well, to say that, it's kind of a misunderstanding of what the word belief truly is. Right. Belief doesn't necessarily mean that you're looking to hold a concept of reality that can't be proven or that is fantastic. Belief really is an effort, again, to map our thoughts to what we believe to be reality. Right. Anything that you would add in particular, not just to the literature here, but to draw in the theistic audience in framing how we're going to be talking about this specifically?
Yeah. The way he focuses on this definition, argumentatively speaking, there are three main prongs of an argument. You can have pathos, ethos, and logos. Mm-hmm. Pathos is an argument based on feeling. Ethos is when you're relying on the authority of the speaker, and logos is when you're looking at logic and fact. Mm-hmm. And his argument, or his definition rather, for belief in that regard is the act of acknowledging something to be true, or holding something to be true, based on the accumulation of fact or relying on the authority from which it comes. Mm-hmm. So his definition is narrowed down of the three to ethos and logos. Mm. You're relying on ethos, the authority from which you get this information, or logos, the fact. And I appreciate his distinction between the two, because so much of, I think, the the non-theist argument against the theist argument is that for theists, the non-theist believes that we believe what we believe because we're told to believe it. It's an entirely ethos-based argument. We're believing it on the authority of either scripture or based on the authority of the pastor, priest, whatever religious authority we have. And if our belief is entirely an ethos-based argument, then it's understandable for someone to criticize it, because there is a limit to an ethos argument. If it's based solely on authority, that is, in a way, a logical fallacy. But the other side of that definition is the logos, the fact or the experience that you have. And for those that are religious, those that are theist, there is a personal experience that goes to it, that, especially those that have grown enough to question their own religion, to question their own beliefs, as it were, and to try them in a scientific method, if you will, that if they don't work, then we do adapt, and we do grow from it. That it's not entirely an ethos-based argument, because, again, going back to Fowler, if you're looking at stage 2 and stage 3, that's an ethos or authoritarian or authority-based decision. The stage 2 is the authority of Scripture, that defines you. Stage 3 is the authority of the religious authority that you have, the religious institution. So both of those are ethos-based, the first part of his definition. But once you move into stage 4 and to stage 5, which isn't to say it doesn't happen in stage 3, but it's also experiential, it's also fact-based, from your own inquiry. So it's important for theists to hold true to both sides of that. And for theists, I would say for own theists in the audience, to grow, we need to be able to differentiate between our beliefs that are ethos or authority-based versus those beliefs that are logos or fact-based in our own experience.
Yeah, surely. And it's interesting. We keep reintroducing the stages, which, again, it's important too, because it creates that common language. But looking at even the how we discern belief with experiences versus what we're told, and the research that we can get in our hands, it would seem to me that a large majority of the religious do base belief off of personal experience. As a matter of fact, that might even be the most important belief that they hold, is what they feel or what they've experienced themselves, and that holds a level of conviction that is almost unshakable versus the information that they get from another source that they haven't necessarily experienced.
Right.
Why do you think that is so?
I think it boils down to you can trust yourself more than you can trust others. And that's a human inclination.
Yeah, true.
I mean, if you come and tell me that this iron here is hot and I've touched it and it's cold to me, I'm going to trust my own reasoning.
Sure.
Now, if it turns out that, let's say, I have leprosy and I no longer have sensation in this, and I touch it and it's not hot to me, then that's a limit of my own reasoning skills or a misunderstanding of my own limits and boundaries. And that's the fine line, is that where do you recognize with humility the own limit of your reasoning, the own limit of your experience, compared to the authority of others who have researched this, who might have a greater view of it. But being able to discern that it's a difficult task.
Even a level of skepticism there, I would say, in those who are religious. It's with everyone. Again, we all hold the same anatomical features in our brain, and we're all wired to, at least before I go into that, we have the ability to get to a point where we can think about that. Some of us are at that at a greater scale. But it's that one-on-one, right? Like, if you have an experience that you feel and that you hold to belief versus just one person saying otherwise, who may be unqualified, or versus a group of people that hold a different belief, they're all saying the same thing, you might be inclined to think so as well. I mean, that's kind of the foundation of groupthink, right? If everyone starts saying one thing, you'll join in on that.
And the other hazard with that is, I can't remember if Harris points it out or if I've just been reading too many articles about this recently. But it's the idea that with in light of all the fake news that came out during the elections.
Mm-hmm.
We had a remarkable example en masse of the ability to look for and not discern the news that you're seeing. The idea that we look for and affirm that kind of news or that information that reaffirms what we already believed.
Mm-hmm.
So we are more prone to believe something is true, to look at it as an authority if it already reinstates and reaffirms what we previously held.
Sure.
Which is what made the rash of fake news so insidious
Mm-hmm.
and so easy. Is that it's the human tendency. If I already believe it and now I see it on the web because that's the authority, again going to an ethos argument rather than a logos, but confusing ethos for logos and vice versa. Where it should be a fact-finding mission, I'm now just relying on the authority of this article because I think it comes from a reputable news source.
Sure.
Then I'm prone to believe it. Move that into theism. And the arguments and the conversations that we have betwixt denominations and even entire faiths, we tend to isolate ourselves with those that believe the same thing we believe.
Yeah.
And we don't push ourselves to really hold it critically.
Mm-hmm.
And we convince ourselves that we are when we're listening to multiple sources, when in fact we're just listening to a select multiple source, or select multiple sources that reinstate and reaffirm what we already believe.
I almost wonder if, at default, that is the human condition. And I mean, this is a great segue.
Think so.
You certainly. Moving into where is belief located? This is a great, transition into that when we look at the brain and where we find belief. That is, where do we find the brain lighting up most when we are asked to answer a question? Mm-hmm. Do you have brown hair? Are you a resident of California? Is the president Donald Trump? All of these things are things that we certainly believe, and Harris goes to point out that this is one of the first tests that he distributed where you're testing belief. People are quicker to answer something that they believe in versus something that they're not so sure on. Obviously, I mean, but when you look at where it's located in the brain, looking at the medial prefrontal cortex, also responsible for several other things. And I'd like to read something from the book directly on the medial prefrontal cortex, where belief processing suggests an anatomical link between pure cognitive aspects and emotion and reward. In fact, mathematical belief showed a similar pattern of ethical belief. The reason why brain patterns are important to consider is because there is no core for belief and thoughts, and actions arise from no single node, but multiple neural processes. Here we see an anatomical bridge between facts and values, and as a result, how can we say that scientific and ethical values have nothing in common? All this suggests is that there must be an analogy, if not identity, between the two domains. And we can talk about that aspect in a bit. But what I found really interesting is a little later he goes in to say that the medial prefrontal cortex is likely linked to self-perception, reward, as well as our belief on reality and the system that we have for what reality is. And in this sense, I start to think that when you try to change one's mind, or if one is presented with information that conflicts with their system of belief, you're almost, in a sense, subconsciously challenging their self-perception. Mm-hmm. You're challenging their reward system. And we have a tendency to like the truth if it is something that can help us understand reality more. And we have a dislike for falsehoods, mm-hmm. Which is interesting, going back to what you were just saying with all the news coming out. We're so easy to grasp something that we already think is true or align closely to what we believe versus that which isn't. Even though it might be the truth itself, what we're looking at is the fact that we feel uncomfortable. It's not just as easy as changing belief. Right. It's equivocable anatomically to challenging something that you feel reward from. Imagine taking away someone's coffee who drinks coffee every morning. That is a reward to them, and in a sense, a level of addiction. And I don't want to confuse belief with addiction. although we probably could if we wanted to stretch
Right,
it.
you could run that.
Yeah, but yeah. So if we take away something that is offering a reward to somebody, it's similar to challenging belief, and I'm not saying that it's identical, but there's a similarity there. And this part of the brain has this promiscuity with other functions that when experienced, it might feel the same. So here, I think this is kind of the core of when we have the theist and a non-theist challenging their beliefs, when we have a liberal and a conservative going head to head. And Sam even posted research on this, the neuroscience of counter evidence in regards to political belief. And we even posted that on our Facebook page if you're curious to check out the research. It's a great paper. But what does all this mean? Okay, we have similar areas of the brain lighting up. What does that translate to how we experience the world? The brain itself, and this is probably the most poetic thing that Sam has written, to imagine that our most sophisticated parts of the brain obviously stem from less sophisticated parts. We are, in every sense, a boat that has been building itself plank by plank as the hull was being beaten by the ocean. And when you put it that way, there are going to be regions of the brain that are responsible and experience and express many different things, not just one. The prefrontal cortex is not just responsible for thinking, and that's it. So this can result in lots of confusion and even cognitive dissonance, as we discussed so many times before. So when we look for belief in the brain in this sense, how do you think that we can make progress when discussing, going back to the main premise here, when discussing whether or not a culture's morality is right or wrong, whether or not it is better or worse for the rest of humanity?
Well, I mean, if you look at the neuroimaging, and if we're going to delve into whether or not that can discern right or wrong in moral thinking, from what I gather of it, the area of belief, whether you're talking about your religious belief, political belief, or any belief, that I believe this to be true, that California is a state, that God exists, both of those light up the same area of the brain, because that's the area that says, I believe this, I hold this to be true. And that creates my identity. It makes my identity feel good because I have that truth, that kind of thing.
Yep.
I think as far as Dr. Harris's argument, it shows that it's going to be, as far as neural imaging, it's going to be more difficult to say whether or not a belief in something is going to discern whether or not it is morally true or not. I think the point of his argument here is to, in fact, detach belief from the moral argument. Because if I can say, I believe all dogs go to heaven, and then the person over here says, I believe that dogs don't have souls, we both believe in the same part of our brain with the same tenacity. And if I say, I believe that people should be executed because they have committed murder, and then another would say, I believe that people should not be killed as a punishment because I do not believe that murder is acceptable in any circumstance, the same part of the brain lights up. And if you can have two opposite decisions lighting up the same part of the brain, it shows that that part of the brain has nothing to do with the moral relevancy of the two, as far as a more objective view, but it is purely subjective and related to your identity. So if our belief is rooted in that aspect of creating our identity, then we have to find a more objective means of detaching it.
Well, I think that Sam is actually arguing the opposite of that, that what we believe versus what is true and factual aren't things that we can just freely choose from. Later on, he obviously goes to paint a picture. Are you free to choose, or are you free to believe whether or not George Washington was the first president of the United States? Of course not. And if anyone chose to believe otherwise, we could not take him seriously. And I mean, this translates, going back to facts and values, they're not entirely separate, even anatomically, and what we find in neuroscience. So should we then take that and treat them exclusively? mutually exclusive in our intellectual conversations surrounding it. Sam is suggesting that we don't need to, and we can talk about them similarly. And that's how we can construct an objective view between facts and values, and how they can go hand in hand. But I think what you're trying to say, if I can understand correctly, what makes a person feel good, obviously no one can tell them whether or not they're feeling good about a particular belief or a particular value. And I certainly don't think that's what he's trying to suggest. But what he might be saying is that for you to feel good is one thing. Whether or not the validity of the source that's making you feel good is valid, true, good or bad, is another conversation. But if it just so happens that what's making you feel good might be the wrong thing to be believing in, for example, let's kill every third child or blind every third child born, as he illustrates an example of, then with the research, we have to be able to understand that this is going to cause discomfort and maybe an identity crisis. But it is for the better. That's the conversation that's hard to have.
Right.
How can we convince somebody that it is for the better?
Right.
And this is probably where the source of most of the kickback is coming from.
And a lot of that hinges on bias, which is the next part that he tackles. Yeah.
Looking at bias here, I did get a short bit that I thought was interesting. That these are cognitive biases, right? And they cannot help but influence our public discourse, as we're having now. What I thought was interesting, and I did tag this mostly because at first I was kind of shocked. I was like, that I wouldn't have expected this right off the bat. But the more I think about it, I see that it makes sense. And this is in regards to a particular topic that I don't want to spend too much time on right now. We have plans to record a future episode in regards to the example of race that he brings up here. But this is just to illustrate the effects that bias have on belief. And I don't want anyone in the audience to think that we're skimming over the importance of racism. So just want to lay that out first. He goes to say, surely we can say that a belief system known to be especially beholden to dogmatism, inflexibility, death anxiety, and a need for closure will be less principled, less warranted, and less responsive to reason and evidence than it would otherwise be. This is not to say that liberalism isn't also oculated by certain biases. In a recent study of moral reasoning, and the moral reasoning study that he's referencing is Pizarro and Ullman in 2008, for those who are interested. Subjects were asked to judge whether it was morally correct to sacrifice the life of one person to save 100, while being given subtle clues as to the races of the people involved. The results were, conservatives proved less biased by race than liberals, therefore more even-handed, which, given the recent election, it would cause one to raise one's brow almost. Liberals, as it turns out, were very eager to sacrifice a white person to save 100 non-whites, but not the other way around, all the while maintaining that considerations of race had not entered into their thinking. So this is an interesting dynamic. In the first part, I guess on the side of liberals, we see the importance of this whole whitewashing and that whites are on a pedestal, considering the history of the United States, maybe even the history of the world, that but especially the United States, that it's important to really make efforts to level out the field for race. And holding that particular bias is what made it easy to sacrifice an individual white person to save other races, but the other way around, and let's just paint the example, would you sacrifice a black American to save 1,000 whites? For those who hold this construct or this bias in their mind, not that it's bad, but when you hold that, it is going to slow your moral reasoning to sacrifice an individual. Whereas if we're really just talking about numerical data here, it's certainly going to be better to sacrifice one individual to save 1,000. I just want to see if you agree or disagree with that first. Would you just completely numerical sacrifice one to save 1,000? Yes or no?
Yes.
Yeah, and I would too. And I should think that anyone would, regardless of what race or ethnicity or culture. But I think this is...
and you get into moral thinking. This is
yeah.
where Kohlberg comes in,
Yeah, I know.
because if we're doing it intentionally, a la The Lottery, a fantastic little story if y'all want to read it, where you're intentionally sacrificing one or destroying one person for the sake of others, then the diminishment of that one life, while others have a quote-unquote good life, even Harris points out that when they know that their benefit is based off of the punishment of another, then subconsciously, at the very least, that part of the brain kicks in that shows they're mitigating punishment and damage as opposed to pleasure and positive enjoyment. So the circumstances around how the sacrifice would happen of that one person,
well, yeah, that's
is going to fit into it.
Sure, yeah, but that's a good point, because I think that's going to introduce another level of bias.
But this also brings up the difficulty of Harris's argument, as far as, since he is so much on the outcome, the action being moral or not. Will you sacrifice one to save 1,000? That's the final outcome. Without the moral reasoning behind it, then you come up with a standard equation of morality that, yes, one person can be sacrificed to save 1,000, whatever instance that may be. And without the moral thinking behind it, or the nuance of situation and circumstance, we tend to lose the subjectivity or the ambiguity.
Sure, yeah, and he's no stranger to acknowledging that. Even with the Heinz dilemma, he goes to acknowledge that given any real circumstance of real life events, the trolley problem becomes much more complicated. And you would probably find more than just the two ways given to you to find a workaround.
Right.
But solely just to paint the picture of what bias does to one's belief system, it's certainly important to take it into consideration. And we see it in multiple facets of our life. And we don't really have much control over whether or not we have bias or not. It's just going to be there. But going back to what you were talking about, biases, even though all too brief in the book, I think it could obviously be a novel in itself. It's important to take that into consideration because those biases are going to change culture to culture, even in households. This is it makes it more difficult to have a conversation especially with what one believes,
right?
And versus what systematically would be optimal choices for moral thinking or moral outcome. But as to not spend too much time on bias, what aspects of bias, considering the literature, in your perspective, are going to affect moral thinking more than not? Can we use biases to our advantage for moral thinking? Or is it truly something that is going to impede progress? And otherwise, if we were just to run any sort of algorithm through a computer to tell us how to be moral, for example.
Right. I think, when it comes to moral thinking, the biggest bias you're going to find with moral decisions is one, religious upbringing and religious doctrine, as well as political. And political could even be expanded as far as cultural. Now, obviously, the defining line between religious thinking and cultural thinking, especially when you have a religious culture, is going to be a very, very expansive gray area, if you will. But I feel those are going to be the biggest biases. What you're taught culturally as you're raised, what you're taught religiously as you're raised. With that in mind, the lesson I get from this is that bias is inevitable, no matter where you are.
Sure.
The important thing is not necessarily to denigrate bias, because you could have a positive bias. You could have a bias that taught you well and leads you to better decisions. It's still a bias.
A bias for evidence.
Yeah, something like that. I think the important thing is realizing that we all have bias, and to make good moral thinking, to be healthy human beings, is to spend that effort and that time being self-reflective to figure out what our biases are.
Understanding that your belief is going to forge that
bias.
Yeah.
And that when you come to a decision, you are going to bring your bias, but if you know yourself better, you are not acting blindly from that bias.
Sure.
That if a liberal recognizes that they have a racial bias, and that they will sacrifice a white person more than they would a person of color, as whether out of a concept of guilt or reverse reparation or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
If the bias is there in a grander scale to help balance out a system that is already unequal,
mm-hmm.
then perhaps the bias is not a bad thing.
Yeah.
And if we recognize it, it doesn't stop us from living into the bias, but we at least know where that bias is coming from and what the bias is leading us to do.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that self-reflective measure of understanding our own impulses and our own intentions, which requires a lot of help through trained professionals, whether therapy, group counsel, any of these kind of things that help us understand our thinking and our development. The bias isn't a bad thing. It's just important, rather, to know where they are so that we know when they're actually acting.
True, yeah. And all the efforts we can make towards understanding how the world works, understanding all the research that has gone into morality, all the discussions that we've had on morality. Surely there have been plenty of intellectual conversations that have furthered us. Obviously, look at the progress we've made in the U.S. alone over the past 300 years. What he touches on next is really interesting because it's understanding our limits. And we have belief, and from belief we get biases, and there is a wall that we do reach, and we have to be able to understand that from an individual perspective. And this, he goes back to mistaking, he goes back to his proposition that if one is to mistake no answers in practice for no answers in principle, that is a mistake that you're making in terms of morality. We can have answers in principle for morality, although we might not always be able to see it in practice with our individual experiences. Right. And in this section of the chapter, I think, is a summation of that. And he ends it with, as science advances, we are increasingly coming to understand our natural limits of understanding. So this paints it, or this brings it back to what he's trying to propose with the moral landscape, is that science can determine our values because our understanding is limited on the grand scheme of things, because we're limited by bias, because we're limited by belief. And not to look at so much of what science can tell us about all aspects of morality. That's not what he's proposing at all. Again, it's only some answers, and there are some that it'll never be able to determine. But the individual or even collective groups are going to have a problem with answering as much as science probably could about it. Do you think that we have a limit with our understanding of morality? Or is morality being a construct of our own minds? Does that enable us to not have a limit? If I can just get a little philosophy.
Goodness. I think in our current state, in practice, there is a limit to our morality, and that we have conflicting moral views. That we as a culture have not developed nor taught subsequent generations moral thinking, so that moral thinking is commonplace in parlance to everyday conversation. I think we are limited in that. That being the case, there's obviously room for growth in moral thinking and teaching and developing moral thinking, because we can think morally and engage in those conversations. I do not think there is a limit there. We just haven't explored it enough. Do I think that science is going to be the fundamental answer to create that moral landscape the way that Harris says it? I don't think so. I think there are some things that can be looked objectively from a scientific point of view. But as Harris constantly goes and constantly uses, these are all big actions, these low-hanging fruit. My interest in morality is not just the big issues. Do we allow a civil war to decimate a population through genocide? My concerns of morality are on a far more day-to-day basis in moral thinking. Mm-hmm. And that's where I think we need to teach moral thinking, develop moral thinking as a culture, the way that we teach economics. When you're raising a child, I raise a child to know this is how you are in debt, this is how you balance good debt to bad debt, this is how you save money, and we teach people to think economically. Mm-hmm. I look at two prices here, which one is the better deal? We teach economics. We don't teach moral thinking.
Well, but that's the exact bridge I think that he's trying to draw too. I mean, have we come with a perfect economic code? Probably not, but we can point to certain economic systems that are better than others, and we can break that down into a science. And these, after all, are values. We have a value and a desire to create commerce, to create, well, I was going to say wealth equality, but that's not the case anywhere, is it? Perhaps a value we should adopt. But we can say that the U.S. Economic standing is certainly better than third world countries. Mm-hmm. And why is that? And I'm sure someone out there will bring in a full economic discussion on this, to which I'm ignorant, and I'm not trying to engage in that or make any claims there.
But in fact, you might have your own bias because you're in the system. You believe it's good.
Who am I to say that
better than third world? When in fact we are based off the economies of third world and perpetuate third world economies to make ours better.
Conversation about how we're lost in materialism. Third world countries are better off because they're more enriched in their belief. Right. In any case, the line that Harris tries to draw and make an example of is that there are components of economy, just as he's suggesting there are components about morality. Whether they're low-hanging fruit or not, I think he'd be happy just to have a science of low-hanging fruit morality because it's a start to
it's certainly better than what we have.
Sure. And if we can at least start with that, then we might be better off. If the only thing that we can teach the world objectively and everyone follows and understands that it puts us towards a global flourishing of human well-being, that we shouldn't kill each other, that'd be a great step to start with. And if that's the only thing that comes from the science, I think Harris will die happy.
Right.
But it's a start. And I think that, again, overlapping values with facts and beliefs and reality, these are important things to take hand in hand as we try to even think about a science of morality. But going from, that being our limits, this is actually a good segue into belief and reasoning and how belief itself affects reasoning. And so most of what we believe comes from two types of reasoning. We have inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning. Inductive being that you probably have a pancreas because people generally have the same parts, and deductive being that gold is more expensive than silver, silver being more expensive than tin, so we can deduct that gold is more expensive than tin. So we have this, and again, we can even tie this back to biases because we generally succumb to them. And bias just isn't a source of error. Right? And Harris goes to say that it is a reliable source of error. It's something that we can expect to happen. So interested, going back to this inductive and deductive reasoning, something he points out that I wanted to bring up here for conversation is that research shows that we have a bias for sound conclusions and judge a valid argument to be invalid if a conclusion lacks credibility. Therefore, we can see abstract logic and practical reasoning are in conflict. And this is exactly what you were just talking about, actually, that we favor arguments that seem to be valid, and that the validity of an argument's conclusion will be determined on what we believe. This goes back to the fake news. If something sounds absurd, or if we don't see it as having any sort of like a solid conclusion, or the conclusion itself seems to be invalid, dominantly because we don't agree with it, we're going to throw it out, and we'll probably be very quick to label it as fake news or a weak argument. So, with this being said, we could be looking at a solid argument, something that is sound, and a conclusion that is valid. But if it doesn't fold into what we believe with, our belief is going to navigate that. So then, how do we convince somebody that they should have a respect for sound logic over abstract beliefs?
I think the way to navigate it, and this is where I think religion needs to be held in theist belief, it needs to be appreciated as it is in culture and in our thinking. You can teach logic and you can hold up logical thinking if you're using the language of the person you're talking to. And that is to say, use their frame of reference, their context. You can challenge what someone believes if you know how to use the language that they're familiar with. Another way to put it is an article I saw not too long ago that draws back to Greek philosophy. Says the best way to convince someone is to start by pointing out and agreeing with what they believe.
Sure.
Agree with what they believe so that they know you're on their side, and then start to challenge. But as I say, start from where they are and then move.
And I want to make a point. This isn't a goal for manipulation, or perhaps you might even be able to call it, but doing it in an honest way.
Right.
To just propose information, if that's the wall you have to get through just to even propose what you have to say for someone to consider it, then it's not malice. You're trying to get everyone on the same page. And it's a reason why I think you and I can have fruitful conversations, whether or not it moves us towards an enlightened stage of morality or stages of faith, have you. But it's important, and I think this even is a core message of our show, to get people on the same page. And this is what Neil deGrasse Tyson called out Richard Dawkins for, is because Dawkins, as you know, just spearheads everyone with while they're valid arguments, and it's all in the sake for preserving the schools and the scientific educational sphere from being injected with creationism, for example. Could he be more successful if he practiced what you just said? And I think probably so. Right. Tyson seems to think so. But I think it's also you're getting to a point where, with the age of technology and information coming about, people like Dawkins are just out of patience. Right. And perhaps the value for the stuff that Harris Dawkins did, etc., will provide us the true heroes of getting us out of a dark age of fundamental religious thought and just exclusive. Not that we are anymore, but if we don't challenge it with some of the tactics that they've put forth, or some of the information they put forth with a more reciprocal tactic that you just pointed out, then we very well could see creationism getting into our schools. I think it was a couple of years ago, Tennessee had introduced the whole label in the textbook where this is just a theory of evolution. That's dangerous, right? So,
which leads to a point when you have an administration that doesn't believe in science. When you have the head of the EPA who doesn't believe in the scientific evidence that has been provided that carbon dioxide is a bad thing in surplus. Science, the fact that we live in a world right now, in a country where science has to be defended and even advocated, which should be a given. That scientific truth is something we should accept. But because of prior belief, people don't want to accept it. I think that the great push that Dawkins and the others have done is necessary, because you have to push the pendulum with some degree of force to move it to the other side. It's the laws of gross tonnage here. It's going to require more force to move this much mass, and there's a lot of thinking on the wrong side that needs to get there. So it takes a lot of force, like Dawkins, to get it there. Now the problem is, once it starts moving, do you stay in that gear shift where it's just a violent force to prove your side, or do you start moving into a more common ground discourse?
Aggressive force.
Yeah.
but yeah.
Do you move into an area where you can start allowing voices on both sides to meet in the middle? And I think we're stuck in a point in history right now where the reaction to the action is just as aggressive.
We're spending so much time on that because of the initial tactic of introducing this kind of information.
And I think eventually that's going to die down. I mean, and while it can be frightening, especially for those that are on the scientific end, to see science be denigrated, and to see the effects that could have, it's very frightening to see that in a greater scale. Which goes to Harris's point that were we in a world where morality and moral decisions were based objectively on science, we wouldn't have to worry about whether or not we're going to have a planet that is victim to global warming and the excessive use of limited natural resources. That his moral landscape, were that to exist, this would be a given.
We wouldn't have many of the problems that
we wouldn't have that. So I mean, it's understandable why it's very frightening to see this reaction to it and to be a victim of it. But my hope is, because one is a reaction to the previous action and vice, and it just keeps going back and forth, that's eventually going to settle. That right now we're just seeing the crucible, we're seeing the focal point of this issue finally coming to a very high level, a national level of correspondence. And just as the pendulum's swinging this way right now, we're going to see it swing back. And once it starts swinging again, maybe we can shift, we'll be at a point where we can shift gears and start being in more open dialogue rather than a confrontational or defensive dialogue.
Sure, yeah. I mean, this trickles all the way up to political conflicts that we have when we're talking about belief and reasoning. But of course, when you get into that realm of politics, something that you concentrate more on, and why many people probably have a disgust with politics, is because they're struggling whether or not they're even telling the truth, and with whether their speaking is in line with what they truly believe. And this is a section in the chapter that, admittedly I initially didn't see much value in discussing, but now that we've landed here, perhaps it is worth bringing up that what would a world without lying look like? Because obviously most of what happens, or most of what pushes a country in one direction, is normally the result of a political conversation.
Right.
And if we could have a world where politicians could not lie when they're engaging in conversations that really mattered, where would we be? And I find it almost perfect timing, again, that the example that he brings up in his book. Could you imagine what it would be like if at the United Nations someone were to speak untruthfully, an alarm would go off?
Right.
Boy, how well prepared would we have been recently with the conflict with Syria if we knew that Russia may have not been speaking honestly about removing the chemical weapons from Syria. So perhaps we would be better. And again, this is kind of an abstract what if that he proposes, but it's important to tie into the elements that he's putting forth with the conversations with an individual speaking their mind on what they truly believe and what matters. What is your take on the importance of this section of the chapter, a world without lying?
On the one hand, it makes for what would be a great novel, I suppose, a great science fiction novel. And it seems as a bit of a tangential conversation for his entire book, but I think where it really ties into this is, if not necessarily an alarm that would go off and designate lying with his neuroscience, if we just look at his cognitive dissonance. I think that's the more important alarm that we should be honest with. And, lying is that intentional veiling of the truth. Cognitive dissonance can be a more subconscious battle in ourselves. But when we say one thing but believe another, or we're wrestling between those two truths, I think if we were more honest with ourselves with that cognitive dissonance. And I've known pathological liars, so they believe, it's a bizarre thing when you look at pathological lying, because in a way they should know that they're lying, but they're crafting it such a way that they think it's true.
Oh, they'll eventually believe it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's why it is a pathology, because the brain is not working correctly in this. But if an alarm goes off and says, guess what? You're still wrong. On a lesser scale for our cognitive dissonance, if that would create such a system when we're faced with belief versus fact, that we are more honest with the fact that they are not necessarily settling together.
Yeah.
I think that would be a far greater benefit to this moral conversation, because we are more honest, and that brings up bias again. That brings up a cognitive dissonance when we're not truly settled with our belief, when we're wrestling with fact versus opinion and emotion. That would certainly add a far greater depth to the moral conversations that we have. Were we able to have that more objective alarm go off?
Well, I think that speaks volumes, because most of what we believe to be moral is based off of, again, what the values that we believe in. And so if we can match that true dissonance, whether it's some, again, just bringing in the fantastic here, or some ship that administers a shock, if you're truly in conflict with yourself, because there has to be an incentive to get you beyond just lying, even though you're creating frustration with yourself. Again, the goal of Russia, while they knew that whether or not cognitive dissonance was existing, and they knew they were in conflict with what they were saying versus what they believed, it was still desirable because there was a goal there, ultimately. The goal either being to lie or to still keep chemical weapons in case of X.
Right.
It doesn't mean that they necessarily thought it was bad, but again, it aligns with their beliefs, and that dissonance being present does speak to the fact that people can still act against what they know to morally be wrong, because beliefs and morality are very, I would say, are similar, if not interconnected, with how we view and how we act in the world. So how do you justify that? I mean, that goes back to psychopaths, but again, they don't necessarily have full control over that. They truly just, there is in it several malfunctions with the brain. But, again, we can go into a tangent conversation with this world without lying, but it still ties into how we believe or what we believe, and the values that we get from morality, or that we have in regards to morality. We need to match that up with truth claims about the world, the truth claims about well-being of individuals, and act on that. Again, that's the conversation we're having. How do we convince someone that they should value acting in a good manner that will push someone or push a society towards well-being? But again, we're looking at belief. I want to talk about this, the last segment here in the chapter, the whether or not we have freedom of it, and or is it something that just is there and we can choose to do away with it if it's for the greater good for ourselves. If, like, for example, we have a belief that necessarily isn't constructive or is harmful. I don't have a particular example, and I'm sure we can think of multiple examples where a particular belief system could be harmful for society, but do we have freedom of it? I want to reference the book here, something he says that choosing belief freely is not what rational minds do. Again, I'll go back to the George Washington. I can't choose to believe that Abe Lincoln was the first president of the United States. Mm-hmm. I can't do that. This doesn't mean that we have no mental freedom whatsoever. We don't just choose what makes us feel good and call it belief. And this goes back to the point of that he mentions in the book, that you can be a Christian and then you meet a Muslim woman and then you don't believe that Jesus Christ is the Savior because it makes you feel good that you'll be with this Muslim woman. Mm-hmm. Rational minds just don't work that way.
Right.
But if we have freedom of thought, our beliefs are what we accept because it seems to be true. But we suffer reliable failures in rationality. So, tying this, one can be irrational, but we don't have the choice to believe. How do we marry these two concepts?
The non-theist argument that I hear often is that religious belief and rationality just cannot sit hand in hand. That any rational mind would not believe in theological premises or theistic premises. So the question, as you pose it, is how can the two actually sit together? Can a theist be rational? Can one have belief that is still subjective and responsive to rational thought? Is it possible? Or is belief simply going to be that neurological quality of us that is always going to be dictated by self-preservation? It will preserve itself as a belief in spite of its rational evidence. From a theistic point of view, at least in theistic discussion, I think the two can be married. If you have a religion, if you have a religious institution that encourages and allows for it. Certainly within fundamentalist aspects of religion, you are going to have not just a subconscious division between the two, you're going to have an active teaching against rationality. And that you are denigrated, that you are looked down upon, you are doubted, you are thrown out if you abandon belief. Despite all of this, don't listen to that. It's just going to test your faith. It's a tempting from the devil. Don't do it. That, I think, shows the hazard of belief, if not religious thought in its fundamentalist nature. If it's entirely belief, then that's not going to work with rationality.
Dogmatically.
Right.
Okay.
But can you have belief that is responsive to rationality? I believe absolutely so. Sure. Fowler shows that you can have faith that develops in light of rationality, and that having faith develop and faith thinking develop with rational thought, in fact, creates a more mature faith thinking. If you have a religion that allows for that growth and even helps direct that growth, then all the better. If you have one that doesn't allow for it, then you're going to have a split, and that's where you have to abandon faith with religion. The baby goes out with the bathwater, as it were.
Yeah. And it would seem that in regards to belief, again, efforts to map our thoughts to reality, and rationality, one might even start to ask, well, what should I believe in then? Mm-hmm. If something makes me feel good and I believe in it, for example, an amethyst brings me happiness.
Right.
I'm not going to walk up to somebody and throw the amethyst to the ground. That's mean of me to do that. But is that rational? Probably not.
Right.
But this isn't. I don't want to muddy the waters here and say that because a belief system cannot be justified or because it's not factual, that it has no value to the individual. Mm-hmm. And if, again, we get into this conversation of context, if that belief system or a particular belief system, whether it be true or not, is saving you from something extreme like suicide, I would not be quick to revoke that belief system out of the pretext to my moral compass is I would be essentially murdering someone, either indirectly, if I had the ability to remove belief from the brain instantly like that. So I don't think that's the goal, and that's something I think that whether we want to call them new atheists or atheists in general who aggressively challenge that belief system of the theistic community, that they're not holding on to a belief system just to spite science. They're not holding on to a belief system just to say that all this data confuses us and we want to feel good about afterlife. Some might, but the point is that some, we can assume, statistically, are holding on to it because it gives them the last straw of hope that they need, or else they are probably going to commit suicide, or they're going to lose hope for their family. I won't name names, but I can think of a few of my friends who hold on to religious belief because of all of the issues medically going on with children or themselves that otherwise, if they were to immediately change into a skeptic, it would be depressing. In order to prepare yourself for that, you would have to have decades of being a skeptic to then face that. You can't just expect to change somebody in that way. Right. That's certainly not my goal. But I feel like when we take those particular situations into account and look at the actions that some of the leaders of the atheistic community, and I say leaders in that they're just popular, and they're not actually appointed leaders, but you understand what I'm saying.
Right.
That's what some people might view it as. It is a threat to their life, essentially. And that's where the pushback comes from. But
the way you describe that, the slight, the separation of experience. So here I am as a Christian, contemplative Christian, monastic, and you use the amethyst, the more New Age belief. Right, sure. And amethyst makes me feel good because of its energies. Yeah. And you say, well, I'm not going to pull that away from them because it makes them feel good. It's as long as it helps them, then I'm not going to stop that. But that there, scientifically speaking, there are no energies coming out of this mineral that somehow actually affect them. It's just a belief system. It's a placebo effect.
Yeah, exactly.
But following that argument, to make it sit in the home court, as it were, for me to receive communion, in your eyes, and that argument is no less a placebo effect. To say that for me to receive the presence of the body and blood of Christ, if not through transubstantiation, through the spiritual presence, the real presence in it, and that does affect me, and develops and strengthens my soul, etc. To see it as no more than a placebo effect is nothing short of the Marxist argument that religion is in fact the opiate. It is a chemical that is meant to make you feel good. That religion is an opiate of the masses, and therefore, as long as it's not doing damage, allow them the opium.
Well, let's have this conversation. Sure.
This just became a two-parter episode, by the way.
Right. So now for another 30 minutes. Yeah. Well, let's try to make it as quick as possible. The only conflict I would see there is, sure, I mean, if it's an opium and it makes you feel good, and it furthers your experience, fine, but the only time that I would gain interest in that is that if you're making a claim in transubstantiation, you're making a claim on physics, and I want in on that Nobel Prize. But if you can't produce that evidence, then I'm sorry. I mean, there's a difference between your experience and what you're going for in that, and then what you're claiming to be a fact about our reality. Right. And I know as an individual, those two things go hand in hand, but from my perspective, and then going back to the amethyst, if we're going to have a conversation about this honestly, we have to be willing to admit that there's a right and wrong answer to what we're questioning here. Does the amethyst really instill dopamine in the brain, or level out the dopamine chemicals to resolve an individual's depression? is it the amethyst, or is it the brain regulating itself because it's projecting that into the amethyst? Then that, again, we'll going back to what we can measure with neuroscience. We're talking about the science of the brain, not the supernatural abilities of the stone.
Right.
But I think it's an interesting conversation to have. I would love to have it in another episode and perhaps get someone on who believes in stones just to make it interesting. But I don't know if I addressed anything that you had that you were trying to draw out from me there. But hopefully, to sum it up, there's a right and wrong answer to what's actually going on.
Right.
It's not my place, and who am I to take that from you?
Mm-hmm.
But if you're going to enter into a scientific conversation about it, be prepared to look at.
And I think where, and this will certainly be a conversation for a later episode.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, this may be a good way to wrap up our episode today,
mm-hmm.
with the understanding that there's going to be a further conversation on this,
mm-hmm.
because Harris's next chapter is religion.
Yes,
and he just tackles religion as he usually does, which is a conversation you and I have had numerous times. So I think what we're going to do for our audience is use that chapter, not necessarily as a review of that chapter, but that will be the starting point for the big conversation for common ground between a non-theist and a theist. So what's up with religion?
Mm-hmm.
But
the name of the episode.
Yeah, but I think to the whole opiate effect of religion, he points out in the chapter of belief that those that have the better receptor for dopamine, the D4,
mm-hmm.
I think, that they are more prone to faith thinking and belief. So it is a neurological, chemical situation that's going on. Mm-hmm. And if we look at just the action, that I'm holding this amethyst because I do believe that the energies in it better affect me, and that is creating the neurological chemical component of dopamine happening and therefore making me happier. Mm-hmm. And that is then challenged by science. And if I'm faced between my ability to be happy because I believe in this, which is now an emotional decision, mm-hmm. not a rational decision.
Sure.
I have the choice, if not the training, to balance out the rational evidence versus my emotional experience. And for most people, if they are not trained, they're going to pick the emotional experience, because just as Harris points out, and just as, I love this because this is one of the few points where Deepak Chopra and Harris sit in the same seat. And I'm sure Dr. Harris is rotating his premature grave on this one. But Chopra pointed out that the lizard part of our brain, that emotional part of our brain, is substantially older than the rational part of our brain, and that we do not make rational decisions. We make emotional decisions that we then try to rationalize. Mm-hmm. That when left to our own devices, that's how the human's going to work.
Sure.
And unless we have been trained to think rationally and deal with that cognitive dissonance, we're not going to make a better decision or a different decision. I think that the growth part of that, recognizing even the dopamine spot, that still allows for religious thought and belief, goes to our maturing of belief and our faith thinking. That, again, going back to Fowler, that you can look at something literally, and then you can eventually look at it allegorically, and you look at it more metaphorically. And look at the difference between a little T truth and a big T truth. That the greater meaning for this in my life is not to say that it literally is the physical body and blood of Christ, but that in its substance, in its Aristotelian definition, mm-hmm. before it was misconstrued through language, the substance, the underneath beingness of this is changed into the real presence, that it is still physically, chemically a wafer and wine, mm-hmm. but its real presence and my connection to it as a symbol that now participates with me in what it represents, that is now the real presence of something bigger than I am. Mm-hmm. that aspect is still part of my faith and my belief thinking. And if I am wired in my brain for belief and faith thinking,
Yeah.
then that is what allows me to function and therefore connect to this and the greater world.
Mm.
That connection is therefore my religious experience.
Right. I think the only rebuttal or the problem that any scientist has with that, and the explanation that you give makes sense. Mm-hmm. It's a deeper understanding and a connection to your faith. Mm-hmm. I highly doubt that any rational person truly believes that the chemical compound of a wafer turns into the skin and flesh of an ancient man. Mm-hmm. But some probably do.
They do, absolutely.
And props to Chopra for being able to string together a sentence of words that actually made sense, and it just so happened to be accurate. So, anyways,
Dr. Harris appreciates that yes. from you, just to balance things back out.
So it's he does it to himself, man. He paints himself as a target.
To wrap up our episode, because I know we tend to go on.
Yeah.
Any final thoughts?
Yeah, I wanted to end with a few more quotes. One from the afterword, which I value because it's a succinct sentence that kind of gets to the core of the book. So I'll start with that. Harris goes to say, I'm claiming that people's actual values and desires are fully determined by an objective reality, and that we can conceptually get behind all of this. Indeed, we must, in order to talk about what is actually good. If a person cares about something that is not compatible with the peak of human flourishing, given the requisite changes of his brain, he would recognize that he was wrong to care about this thing in the first place. Wrong in what sense? Wrong in the sense that he didn't know what he was missing. This is the core of my argument. I am claiming that there must be frontiers of human well-being that await our discovery, and certain interests and preferences surely blind us to them. And going to the end of his chapter here of belief, and this is something I was hinting towards earlier on, like asking what should we believe among the variety of things that are not factual to belief. What should I believe and why should I believe it is generally a scientific question. Believe in a proposition because it is well supported by theory and evidence. Believe it because it has been experimentally verified. Believe it because a generation of smart people have tried their best to falsify it and failed. Believe it because it seems true, or if it is true. As far as our understanding of the world is concerned, there are no facts without values. And this is something I was going on and on about during our conversation, that facts and values do go hand in hand. And it would require a deeper understanding on my part about neuroscience to really be able to express this fully or more accurately, or from a qualified perspective even, to get that point across. But those in short would be my final thoughts. Is it seems like the next chapter will use it as a springboard to our own conversation, not necessarily reviewing the book as we have, but the final thoughts overall. I mean, the three sections that we reviewed: moral truth, good and evil, and belief. I think Harris is on to something that we should consider as a new science, or at least be courageous enough to look at the research that can go into it. And if his work turns out to be not able to yield fruit, then so be it.
Right.
But it's better to see if we can get there than not, as to open our understanding of what morality could be, if it is indeed something we can make factual claims on. So that'd be it. How about you? Any final thoughts on the book itself?
I applaud his project, his hypothesis. Mm-hmm. I mean, to think that there could be an objective view of morality that would go across cultures, just as a human condition. What is it to be a moral human, regardless of situation? That would be neat. I think, however, that he does not go enough in depth on the smaller moral issues. He doesn't deal enough with moral thinking. His is far more the moral outcome of a single action. And it's for big issues. It's the low-hanging fruit. And while he says there's no way to count the numbers of grains of sand on a beach, that does not mean that there is not, in fact, a finite number of those. Just because we cannot come up with a scientific moral backing for every moral decision doesn't mean we shouldn't try this idea of an objective scientific morality. I get that, and I think there's merit to that. The problem is, if it's going to be an actual practice that we can use, then it is something that has to get into the nitty-gritty, that has to get into the more mundane moral decisions that we have. And I don't see an applicability for that. If it is a scientific definition for morality that allows us those big decisions, whether or not you should allow a genocide or the gassing of an entire city to eradicate rebels and support a corrupt president in a foreign country and how you retaliate. If this can be applied to that so that we come up with something more subjective and not politically biased, then I'm for it. But I have difficulty seeing how it's going to apply to the more ambiguous decisions, the more mundane moral decisions, and how best it would take into consideration cultural diversity. I know he wants to throw that out from the anthropological standpoint, that he doesn't believe in that relativism. But I think to a degree there is a cultural relativism that has to be taken into consideration. I think you can go to both extremes. You can either be purely relativistic and see the damage in that, as he points out. I'll grant him that. But you can be at the opposite end, and then you wind up with globalism that eradicates cultures for the sake of morality, for your objective morality. And how that would be navigated, I don't see him really addressing.
Perhaps it's not to go on. We'll wrap it up. Perhaps that's what is intended by peaks on the moral landscape. There will exist millions, and it's not as easy to have a conversation about morality as it is about nutrition. But imagine what it would look like if we had a morality pyramid.
Right.
2 servings of altruism a day. All right. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for tuning in. Again, Sam Harris, The Moral Landscape. I highly recommend it. It's fairly affordable on Amazon. You can also get it on Audible. If you like this, please be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and like our Facebook page. And until next time.
Cause peace.